Senator from Rhode Island.
Let me first thank my friend Senator Schatz for his incredibly kind remarks. He is an outstanding colleague. We work together extremely well. He brings a good cop aloha sensibility to a conversation, which I tend to lean more towards the bad cop. And he has a remarkable vision for how this can be solved. And so I'm incredibly honored that he's here. For the 250th week that the Senate has been in session, I rise to call this chamber to wake up to the threat of climate change. In April of 2012, I delivered the first of these speeches. I know that many in Washington would prefer to ignore this issue, but nature keeps sending us messages we ignore at our peril. It was a cry of frustration that the Supreme Court's infamous Citizens United decision had killed the bipartisan work that I saw here on climate for 3 years. Frustration that the fossil fuel industry's death grip had tightened around this chamber, preventing action. Frustration that our Democratic administration had abandoned leadership on climate change and would barely even talk about it. So it's been a run, and here I am still at it 7 years on. Some things have changed. Some things have not. Let's start with what has not changed. What has not changed is the scientific certainty about what is happening in our atmosphere and oceans. Scientists have understood that burning fossil fuels causes our planet to heat up since the days when Abraham Lincoln was riding around Washington, D.C. in his top hat. This is not new news. Nearly 4 decades ago, Exxon's own scientists reported to Exxon management that there is, quote, little doubt that atmospheric CO2 concentrations were increasing due to fossil fuel burning. They said back in 1982 that the resulting greenhouse effect, and this is a quote from Exxon, would warm the Earth's surface, causing changes in climate, affecting atmospheric and ocean temperatures, rainfall patterns, soil moisture, and potentially melting the polar ice caps. There was no legitimate debate over the science when I started in 2012, and there is no legitimate debate over the science today. Indeed, the science has only strengthened. And with each passing year, as Senator Merkley said, we rely less on complicated climate models and on scientific forecasts, and unfortunately more on straightforward, real-time measurement of the changes. Today, we observe with our own eyes what recently was predicted: glacial collapse and retreat, sea level rise, Arctic warming, and increasingly extreme weather. Another constant since 2012 is the fossil fuel industry's remorseless campaign, A, to block climate action, and B, to do this while hiding its hands behind front groups. I have delivered dozens of these speeches about the dozens of climate denial front groups. Indeed, we've had whole groups of senators come to the floor to talk about the web of denial that the fossil fuel industry has constructed to propagate fake science, to hide that it's the fossil fuel industry pulling these strings, and to push its muscle and weight around Congress. Mostly it's funded by big oil and the Koch brothers. They set these groups up and they set them loose to sow false doubt about real climate science and to obstruct here in Washington. They have spent, at a minimum, hundreds of millions of dollars on this anti-climate campaign. With that money, they've talked up some seriously ridiculous notions, like that carbon pollution is good for us all because carbon is plant food. They've taken out billboards comparing climate scientists to the Unabomber. It is false and ugly stuff powered by hidden money. Oil giants still spend huge amounts to infect America's corporate lobbying with their obstruction message. Influence Map reckons the biggest anti-climate lobbying force in Washington is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, a trade group that purports to represent typical patriotic American businesses. It should more properly be called the U.S. Chamber of Carbon. There it is at the rock bottom, side by side with the National Association of Manufacturers in a statistical tie for worst obstructor of climate action in America. Why wouldn't big oil go to all this trouble? They are defending a $650 billion per year subsidy in the United States alone, according to the International Monetary Fund. So it's logical, but it's still shameful. There is a vast majority of American companies that have a different view and that want to see climate action. But in Congress, that vast majority is a silent majority. When I say silent, I mean they are not showing up in Congress, not to push back, not to correct the record, not even to seek serious climate legislation. Corporate America was AWOL in Congress in 2012, and they are AWOL in Congress now. Corporate America's silence was deafening then, and it's deafening still today. So what has changed since that first speech 7+ years ago? Well, first of all, the economics of renewable energy changed in a big way. In 2012, wind and solar weren't cost competitive with fossil fuels. Storage and electric vehicles were nowhere. That year, the average cost of solar was over $200 per megawatt hour. Today, it's a quarter of that. The cost of wind power is down, and offshore wind is emerging. Battery storage now competes on price with gas-fired peak demand plants in many areas. And automakers around the world are making more and more electric vehicles, driving costs down and performance up for consumers. Even with that massive subsidy for fossil fuel, renewables are starting to win on price. Another new area is that we're starting to capture carbon. This little cube that I have in my hand is CO2 that was pulled out of the air by direct air capture technology and can be turned into tiles, blocks, bricks. There it is. It's the beginning of a new era of carbon capture, and the group that did this is competing in Wyoming this summer for the X Prize for carbon capture. Another big thing that's changed since 2012 is economists, central bankers, Wall Street bankers, real estate professionals, asset managers, all recognizing the major risks that climate change poses to the global economy. It's not free to ignore it, and the costs could come in the form of crashes. Back in 2012, these economic warnings, these crash warnings, were uncommon. Today, they're coming from everywhere. Freddie Mac predicts that rising sea levels will prompt a crash in coastal property values greater than the housing crash that caused the 2008 financial crisis. First Street has shown how sea level rise is already affecting coastal real estate values up and down the East Coast. It found that rising seas have already resulted in $16 billion in lost property values in coastal homes from Maine to Mississippi. Moody's warns climate risk could trigger downgrades in coastal communities' bond ratings. Just last week, the mayor of Honolulu testified at Senator Schatz's Climate Committee's first hearing that the credit rating agencies are already grilling him about this. BlackRock has estimated that some coastal communities face annual average losses of up to 15% of GDP from climate change by the end of the century. Heads up, Florida. Coastal property is not the only financial risk. The Bank of England, Bank of France, Bank of Canada, San Francisco Fed, and European Central Bank, along with many top-tier peer-reviewed economic papers, are all warning of systemic economic risk. That's central banker speak for something that poses a risk to the entire economy, all from stranded fossil fuel assets, what's called the carbon asset bubble. One other thing I've spent a lot of time on is oceans. The heating, the acidification, the lost and shifting fisheries, the collapsing coral and expanding dead zones, and of course, the rising sea levels. Our terrestrial species needs to pay a lot more attention to the seas. And there has been a real shift in attention in these intervening years. Then you have Standard & Poor's and Moody's and Citigroup and more economists warning that the costs of climate change won't be measured in the hundreds of billions, won't even be measured in the trillions, but will be measured in the tens of trillions of dollars. That is a penalty worth avoiding and worth the attention in the Senate. So here I am, 7+ years later, giving my 250th speech. Somewhere between persistent, tiresome, and I suppose foolhardy is where you'll find me. I never thought I'd still be at it well into 2019. But the fossil fuel industry, with all its wretched dark money, is still calling the shots here in Congress, while the rest of corporate America still sits on its hands. The United States Senate still is not seriously considering any serious legislation to reduce carbon pollution, and I'm still frustrated. But I am optimistic because the denial wall is cracking. Bankers and asset managers and financial titans recognize the massive economic risks of a fossil fuel-based economy, and they see the huge economic potential in a low-carbon economy. They now see real business incentive to push back on the fossil fuel denial apparatus. They now see real business peril in allowing the fossil fuel denial apparatus to rule. And I'd ask unanimous consent that the Economist statement published in the Wall Street Journal be appended at the end of my remarks, illustrating that exact point. I am also optimistic because people are talking about climate change again. Colleagues are talking about climate change. Americans everywhere are talking about climate change. Most Republicans want action on climate change. Voters are engaged on climate change, and more than anyone else, especially young people are engaged. From that young hero Greta Thunberg to kids all across this country to the young plaintiffs in the Juliana suit, young people are engaged. Any politician who wants a long career had better care about what young people think. Any political party that wants to matter in a decade had better care. Over in the House, it's starting to show. A few Republicans have actually introduced legislation to put a price on carbon emissions. Even President Trump, the guy who handed the keys to his administration over to the fossil fuel industry, feels the need now to talk about the environment. As empty as that talk is, the pressure he feels is progress. The fact that he feels he has to talk about it is progress. As for me, I can't wait to stop giving these speeches. These speeches chronicle the continued failure of this body, the continued failure of our country to grapple with an evident climate crisis. And these speeches chronicle the fake science and the political mischief and muscle that the fossil fuel industry has used to debauch our American democracy. Marking that sordid history is important, but I want it to be history. When the dark days of denial and obstruction are past, these speeches will no longer be necessary. I particularly want to thank my colleague from Hawaii, Senator Schatz, my colleague from Oregon, Senator Merkley, my colleague from Massachusetts, Senator Markey, and other colleagues who have been incredible friends and allies in this fight, like Senator Heinrich of New Mexico and Senator Warren of Massachusetts, for being here today and for being such extraordinary partners and teammates. We are a band of brothers and sisters in this cause, and our band is growing. As more and more Americans, from kitchen tables to corporate cocktail parties, come to terms with the real scope of the problem and the danger that failure presents, not only am I proud of my colleagues who are with me already, but I'm very hopeful that my colleagues across the aisle will soon also become great partners. Until then, I will conclude now for the 250th time by saying, it's time to wake up. I yield the floor.